Welcome to episode 112 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm going to talk about Neil Young's chart-busting album from 1972, Harvest. It's probably Young's best known album, even if you can make the case that it's not his best album. So when Neil starts to pull this album together in the early part of 1971, what's happened are a number of things that kind of overlap. He's really spent the years from 1967 to 1970-71 totally in the spotlight. He's an intense guy. Aspects of him are very private, and he's backpedaling from all of this success and all of this fame. He's moved to a ranch, which is keeping him somewhat distant from the whole scene. His songwriting is taking a fairly introspective turn. He's also, interestingly, suffering from back trouble, and that's making it hard for him to play electric guitar. He typically had played a Gibson Les Paul, which is pretty much the heaviest guitar that you can play. So he's switched to mainly using a Martin acoustic. So by the time he embarks on a little solo tour in early 1971, including, of course, the famous concert at Massey Hall, he had a whole new set of largely acoustic songs, very personal songs, like Old Man, like Heart of Gold, like The Needle and the Damage Done, which were absolutely blowing audiences away. His vague plan coming together at this point was, when his studio was finished at his ranch, to go back to the studio and record an album, but that was kind of indefinite. Around this time, however, he meets a guy called Elliot Mazer, and Elliot Mazer is a record producer from Nashville who has just built himself a studio called Quadraphonic. And it turns out that one of the artists that Mazer had recorded at his Nashville studio was this little collective of instrumentalists called Area Code 615. And it turns out that Young was a fan of these guys, that he loved the sound that Mazer had achieved, and he said, well, I'd love to come and record at your studio. As it happens, the very next month, Johnny Cash, who had this fantastic kind of crossover TV show where he was inviting pop stars as well as country stars to play, invited Neil Young to come and guest on his show in early February. So Young shows up in Nashville, and the first thing he does is make contact with Mazer. So Mazer has to scramble to pull together some studio musicians who can play with Neil. He calls up Kenny Buttrey, who plays drums, a guy called Ben Keith, who's a steel guitar player. They're also looking for a bass player, a guy called Tim Drummond, whom they can't find until they bump into him walking down the street that evening. Anyway, these guys are all hauled into the studio, and Neil pulls out a guitar and he plays them Heart of Gold. And in the words of Mazer, Kenny Buttrey and I looked at each other and we knew instantly that was a #1 record. And that evening they cut the basic tracks for Heart of Gold and Old Man. The next day, Neil goes to the Johnny Cash show and he tapes that episode. Also on that episode are Linda Ronstadt and James Taylor. Neil says, look, I'm cutting some tracks, come to the studio. And that night, a couple pieces of magic happen. First of all, they do the background vocals to Heart of Gold and Old Man. The second part, and maybe my favorite part of the story, is that when Neil plays them the basic track to Old Man, James Taylor looks around the studio and he sees this instrument, which is a banjo guitar. It's basically a banjo, but it's got 6 strings. He proceeds to play, improvised, a little banjo-like figure on Old Man, which of course is an absolutely unforgettable part of that song. Just happened, spur of the moment serendipity. Young then has a quick visit to the UK. He's got a gig to play on the BBC. He also has another gig at the Royal Festival Hall. After these things, he's got something lined up with Jack Nitzsche, the keyboardist who did work with the Rolling Stones. He also did some work with Phil Spector. Nitzsche has arranged for the London Symphony Orchestra to accompany Neil, and they do some recording at the Barking Assembly Hall. Barking is a suburb of London, and there he records 2 songs with orchestral accompaniment, A Man Needs a Maid and There's a World. He then goes back to Nashville in April, and there he records 3 more songs, Out on the Weekend, Harvest, and Journey Through the Past. As the summer approached in 1971, the studio at Neil's ranch was finally finished, and there they record most of the remaining tracks in the album, including Are You Ready for the Country, Alabama, and Words. There's one more track which is recorded at UCLA during a live performance, and that of course is The Needle and the Damage Done. They get a final tape, and in a famous story, Neil invites David Crosby and Graham Nash up to his ranch to give a listen. They've still got all the speakers set up in the barn. He's got some big speakers set up in his house. The barn is one channel, and the house speakers are another channel. Young apparently was sitting in a rowboat in a pond while the music was coming both out of the house and out of the barn. And to adjust the mix, Neil would shout things like, more barn or more house. Anyway, nice image. When it comes out, it's an absolute monster seller, and Neil is kind of taken aback. It leads him to further and frankly much more profoundly reject commercial success. And so really after this, you have to pick and choose from the rest of his catalog after 1972 to find things that are commercially popular, but there's no denying that what he had here was absolute gold. The record starts with Out on the Weekend. Instantly, we're drawn into this somewhat detached, introspective mood. The song is very clearly about a sense of connection drifting a bit in a relationship. It follows that with Harvest, which is many people's favorite song on the record. It is a very beautiful song. Again, it's got quite obscure lyrics as well. It's a little bit impenetrable. Is this a song about different generations? Is it a love song? Is it a paternal song? Whatever. It's a great song. It's a country song, very clearly a country song, and this whole album is, if not fully, at least substantially a step into the country lane. So far so good. Then we're on to a song which, I won't say it divides fans, but it's got all kinds of elements to it, and not everybody likes all those elements, and that of course is A Man Needs a Maid. It seems to be about somebody who needs to be taken care of, but doesn't necessarily want that to come at the cost of having to have a relationship. It starts off without the orchestral accompaniment. It's just Neil unaccompanied on piano, and it feels, if anything, very much like a Joni Mitchell piece. But then the orchestra comes in at the same moment that he begins to move to the chorus, and the chorus, I think, is just kind of, well, it's just not very strong. It's that high-pitched, slightly whiny Neil sound, a little bit cloying. You've got these sweeping strings, and the orchestration only gets more lush and more exotic. Not a song that I necessarily gravitate to, but the first 20 or 30 seconds I think are amongst the most beautiful things he ever did, if only he continued in that vein. So then we move on to the fourth song, and there's nothing ambiguous about my response to this fourth song. This is Heart of Gold, which of course was a worldwide #1. It's the rock star's lament, but what a lament, and what a catchy song this is. It's got Taylor and Linda Ronstadt providing background singing. It has one of the best riffs that Neil ever wrote. It's got a tremendous lyric. It's kind of like Dylan with rhythmic sense. It is infectious and rewards you every time you listen to it. The closer on side one is Are You Ready for the Country? This is a song which almost intentionally sounds a bit tossed off or a bit of an afterthought. It's basically a little bit of boogie rock, I guess, or boogie country. It has kind of an obscure sort of a lyric. It's not really clear what he's referring to, whether he's referring to country music or whether he's referring to his retreat into the country or what is it. Not a bad song if it doesn't really touch the heights of some of the other music on the record. Side 2 starts with Old Man, which is hands down my favorite Neil Young song. I love the rhythm section of this song, particularly the bass. Young was very specific when recording this at Quadraphonic in Nashville. He told Mazer and the musicians that he wanted the percussive elements to come from the bass and guitar, not from the drums. So he forbade the drummer from playing anything other than bass and snare. And that idea totally pays off. It is a highly percussive song. The drums are very, very subtle. You've got that magical little bit of banjo-y guitar played by Taylor, which completely makes the song. On top of all that, you have this amazing lyric, the inspiration for which was a groundskeeper for his ranch, which he had bought recently, a lyric which is as good as anything Dylan ever came up with. Following that, we now move back into the orchestral experimentation with the London Symphony with the song There's a World. Who knows how the song would have landed with much more simple instrumentation? I suspect much better than it actually does. I find the symphonic arrangement is completely overdone and totally detracts from whatever was happening in the first place. Changing moods and locations again, the next song is Alabama, which is basically a retread of the themes that Neil had recorded in Southern Man. This famously is a song which pushed Lynyrd Skynyrd over the edge and caused him to write Sweet Home Alabama, and Young himself apparently now concedes that this song was a piece of needless provocation. It's a little bit of a window into the work that Neil would do later in the 70s, that somewhat unstudied, harsher sound, which he gravitated to because he found it was more genuine, which frankly, to my ears, just was never that appealing. That isn't true, however, of the next song, The Needle and the Damage Done. This is a very personal song for Young. He'd seen a lot of people ravaged by drug use. These included his Crazy Horse guitarist Danny Whitten and also Bruce Berry, the roadie for the band. Both of these guys were alive at the time, but both would soon die of overdoses. The album closes with what I think is probably one of the other weaker tracks in the record, which is Words. This is kind of a companion piece to Old Man, which starts off this side. Trouble is, it's not nearly as good of a song. What I would consider to be substandard soloing, that kind of tinny guitar tone, which he was kind of enamored with for a lot of his career. I've never really understood that. It ends up occasionally sounding just like a big mess, and I think that's kind of what you end up with on this song. I know people like this song. I'm not really one of those people. The pluses far outweigh the minuses in this record. His backing band are excellent all the way through, as is most of the production done by Mazer. Almost all the songs in this album were done in a couple of takes, which is remarkable. The commitment to live playing and spontaneity and experimentation, for the most part, comes off extremely well. It's actually, strangely enough, the more studied pieces, the orchestral pieces, which fall clanging to the floor. For me, this album is 4.5 out of 5 stars.